Working with layers is one of the most fundamental techniques in any digital image program. In Fresco, I can hide or show the entire layers panel by using the stack icon in the taskbar. I can activate any layer just by tapping on it. And I can tell which layer is active since it's highlighted in blue. We can also hide or show the active layer just by clicking the eyeball toggle on or off. All layers are going to have a basic set of properties which we can access by tapping on the layer properties icon in the taskbar. Make it a habit to use descriptive layer names. This becomes especially important in a document with lots of layers. So I'll call this something like runner. Blend mode controls how colors interact with layers below the active layer. Notice how those color interactions change a little bit. And finally, opacity is just the degree of transparency of the layer. 100 is fully opaque, and 0 is completely transparent. Okay, let's close out of our layer properties and talk about some of the different types of layers that we'll have access to in Fresco. We've got pixel layers, and we can recognize a pixel layer by the little icon that's next to the layer preview. Now we've also got vector layers like this one here at the top. Of course, a vector layer has its own little icon that sits right next to it. We've also got layers like this one, which help us to adjust the color and tone of layers below it. I'll go ahead and turn this on, and we can see how this hue and saturation adjustment layer affects the colors of the house in this image. I can also tell this hue and saturation adjustment layer is clipped to just the layer below it, and I can tell because of that little arrow right there. So when a layer is clipped to the one below it, it's only going to affect that layer. So that's why we only see the color of the house changing as we toggle that adjustment layer on and off. Now we could toggle clipping with this icon in the taskbar, and now you can see that hue and saturation adjustment is applying to all the layers below. I'll go ahead and turn clipping back on, and we can hide that adjustment layer for now. Another layer type that we'll see is a mask. This lets us temporarily hide parts of a layer, almost like we're putting a stencil over it. So I'll turn this on, and while I'm at it, I'll tap my layer actions icon and tap hide all other layers so we can see this a little bit more clearly. So what we have here is an image layer, and attached to that is a mask. So that mask is hiding parts of the layer. It's not actually deleting imagery, just temporarily hiding it for us. Let's go ahead and click our layer actions again, and we'll show all other layers and then hide this one. The stacking order in our layers panel helps us to determine which imagery is in the foreground of our image and which is in the background. So layers on the top are in the foreground, layers at the bottom are in the background. And this really gives us a lot of power in terms of manipulating an image. So for example, I have these trees here on a layer, and maybe instead of having those in the foreground, I'd like to move them behind the house. So to move a layer in the stacking order, all I need to do is tap and hold. You can see the layer expands a little bit, and now I can drag it downwards. So when I let go, now my trees are behind the house, and that helps us feel like we're maybe a little bit closer to our subject, which is the runner. We can easily make new blank layers by clicking the new layer icon in the taskbar, and that inserts a blank layer above the one that was currently active. Now we talked a little bit earlier about layer types, and if we'd like, we can tap and hold on that new icon and create specifically a pixel layer or a vector layer. If we just do the single tap, we'll get a blank layer that isn't assigned to either layer type yet. Now by default, we're only able to activate one layer at a time. But for example, let's say I'd like to get rid of both of these blank layers. So I can tap my layer actions in the taskbar, and let's go ahead and click on select multiple. So notice I get a slightly different dialog at the top of my layers panel, and this is showing me how many layers I have selected. So right now it's 2, and I can go ahead and tap again in that layer actions, and let's go ahead and delete these layers. Let's jump back up to this top layer. This is a vector layer, and I can see it's holding this artwork that's sort of some leaves that are in the foreground. Now, one of the differences between vector layers and pixel layers are the kinds of tools that we have access to for each. So if we try to draw into this vector layer with either the pixel brush or the live brush, watch what happens. So Fresco is actually creating a new separate layer that is apart from my vector layer. And I can see it's labeled as a pixel layer. Let's go ahead and undo that. So if I'd like to draw into that layer, I'd either need to use the vector brush or convert that vector layer to a pixel layer. So since I'd like to use my pixel brush, I'm going to go ahead and convert this active layer to a pixel layer. And I can do that by clicking on the layer actions and down at the bottom, click convert to pixel layer. So notice that my layer icon has changed. My imagery hasn't really changed. And I can now go in with my pixel brush, and maybe I'd like to add some additional brushwork there. Now, one of the greatest things about layers is they let us keep elements of our artwork separate, which makes editing much, much easier. So for example, if I want to grab this runner, maybe I can select the transform tool and move that character to a slightly different place in our composition. I'll go ahead and click done. So we'd often like to combine layers with each other. So let's say, for example, I'd like to combine this runner layer with this ground layer, because maybe I've decided that's exactly where that runner needs to go. So for that, I'll go ahead and select the upper layer, click on my layer actions, and I'll merge down. So this is going to combine that runner layer with the layer below it. Now I can see those are both together in one layer. Now that can be really nice for keeping your layers tidy. Just keep in mind that merge down action is something called a destructive change. That means it's permanent, and it's often a lot more work to pull them apart than it is to merge them together. Sometimes we'll find that we don't like the artwork that's in a particular layer. So for example, I'm not really happy with how these purple leaves turned out. I'd like to delete that imagery and just start over. So let's go ahead and activate that layer and go into the layer actions, and I get some options here. I could delete this entire layer. That would completely remove it from the stack along with all its graphics. Or I could clear the layer, which is going to just remove all the imagery but leave the layer within the stack. Last but not least, I can group layers together almost like I'm putting them in folders. So this is a really useful technique where you have lots and lots of layers. So for example, maybe I'd like to group these background trees and the mountains together with one another. So this is very similar to moving a layer. I'm just going to tap and hold. And instead of dragging it between other layers, I'm dragging it on top of the layer below. So now those are combined into one group. I get a little bit more room in my layers panel, and I still have access to these as separate layers, and I just double tap to see both of them. So sometimes that can be a better option than a merge down if there's any chance that I'd like to go back and edit either one of those. And to get back to the main layer panel, I'll just click the little triangle there. All right, that's a nice quick overview of some basic layer techniques in Adobe Fresco.